Finish this sentence. I'm the kind of person who... Don't think too hard. Just notice what comes next. Maybe. I'm the kind of person who overthinks everything. I'm the kind of person who never gives up. I'm the kind of person who isn't good with money. I'm the kind of person who keeps to myself. I'm the responsible one. I'm the funny one. I'm the one people depend on. I'm just not creative. I'm terrible at relationships. I've always been unlucky. Now here's the interesting part. Where did that sentence come from? Was it written into your birth? Did you consciously choose it? Did someone tell you? Did one experience teach you? Did 20 experiences teach you? Or have you repeated that sentence so many times that eventually you stopped hearing it as a story and started hearing it as a fact? Because there's a strange thing humans do. Something happens. We explain what happens. Then we connect that explanation to another experience, then another. Eventually, the experiences become a pattern. The pattern becomes a story. And the story becomes, this is who I am. But what if some of the things you call your identity are actually interpretations of your history? And if the interpretation changed, would you still be the same person? That's the file we're opening today. Welcome to episode 4 of Life Philosophies. Identity is a story you keep repeating. Last episode, we explored a crucial distinction. You can have a thought without that thought automatically being true. But some thoughts don't disappear. They repeat. They connect to memories. They become explanations. And eventually, they begin telling a larger story about the person having them. A mistake becomes, I always ruin things. A rejection becomes, people don't want me. A success becomes, I'm someone who figures things out. A childhood role becomes, I'm the responsible one. A difficult period becomes, my life never works out. These aren't merely descriptions of events anymore. They're narratives. And narratives matter because they help organize the enormous amount of information contained in a human life. Today, we're going to examine how those stories form, why they can feel permanent, how they influence behavior, where they can become inaccurate, and what it actually means to rewrite part of your identity without pretending your past never happened. The goal isn't to convince you that identity is fake. It's to ask a more careful question. Which parts of the person you believe yourself to be are observations, and which parts are stories you've learned to repeat? Imagine trying to explain your entire life without creating a narrative. Every conversation, every meal, every failure, every success, every friendship, every argument, every boring afternoon, every embarrassing moment, every decision, every coincidence, every place you've lived, every person you've known, every thought you've had. You couldn't communicate all of it, so you compress it. You select certain moments. You connect them. You give them meaning. You can say, I grew up like this. Then this happened. That's why I became, I've always been. After that, I realized. That is narrative, and narrative is useful. Without some continuity between yesterday and today, understanding ourselves would become incredibly difficult. Your personal story helps answer. Where did I come from? What matters to me? What have I survived? What am I trying to become? The problem isn't that you have a story. The problem begins when you forget. A story is an interpretation of events, not the events themselves. Think about your life as if thousands of hours of footage had been recorded. Now imagine somebody asks you to create a 90-minute documentary from all of it. What would you include? What would you cut? Which moments would receive dramatic music? Which conversations would become turning points? Which mistakes would make the final edit? Which victories? Which ordinary moments would disappear completely? This is one way to think about personal identity. Your memory contains enormous amounts of material, but the story you tell about yourself is an edit, and editing creates meaning. Suppose two people have both failed at several businesses. One tells the story, "I clearly don't know what I'm doing. I keep failing." The other says, "I've spent years learning through expensive experiments." Same failures, possibly. Same story? No. And those stories may influence what each person does next. But be careful. We're not saying the second story is automatically true because it sounds more empowering. Maybe the person genuinely has repeated the same avoidable mistake 5 times. Then, "I'm learning" could become an excuse. The goal isn't to choose the nicest story. The goal is to choose the most accurate and useful interpretation the evidence supports. Many identity stories begin before we realize we're creating them. Maybe you were the quiet child, the athletic child, the difficult child, the smart child, the artistic child, the responsible child, the troublemaker, the peacemaker, the one who got good grades, the one who didn't, the one who made everyone laugh. Families, schools, friends, communities, and cultures can hand us labels. Sometimes those labels contain truth. Sometimes they're convenient simplifications. And sometimes we spend years continuing a role because everyone, including us, has become accustomed to it. Imagine someone repeatedly hears, "You're shy." Maybe they genuinely were shy in many situations, but over time, something subtle can happen. Instead of, "I often feel shy," the sentence becomes, "I am shy." Then a new situation appears. They consider speaking, and the identity speaks first. "That's not something I do." Notice the shift. A description of past behavior has become a prediction about future possibility. That's where identity becomes powerful. Once you believe something about yourself, you naturally begin noticing evidence that fits the story. Suppose your story is, "Nobody takes me seriously." Someone interrupts you. That's evidence. Someone disagrees with you. That's evidence. Someone doesn't respond to your message. That's evidence. But what about the people who ask for your advice? What about the person who trusted you with something important? What about the meeting where everyone listened? Those moments may receive less attention because they don't fit the established narrative as neatly. This doesn't mean your identity story is necessarily false. Maybe people in a particular environment genuinely don't respect you. That deserves examination. But once a story becomes established, it can influence what evidence feels important. That's why episode 3 matters. A thought can become a repeated thought. A repeated thought can become an interpretation. An interpretation can become a story. And a story can begin filtering future experience. Now, something even more interesting happens. Your identity can influence your behavior. Your behavior can influence your results. And your results can reinforce your identity. Imagine someone believes, "I'm terrible at meeting new people." They enter a social situation already expecting discomfort. They speak less, avoid eye contact, leave early, meet fewer people, then go home and think, "See, I'm terrible at meeting people." The story influenced the behavior. The behavior influenced the outcome. The outcome became evidence for the original story. The loop looks like this: identity, expectation, behavior, result, reinforced identity. This doesn't mean every outcome is self-created. Other people exist. Luck exists. Circumstances exist. Structural constraints exist. Real obstacles exist. You can behave perfectly and still receive an unfavorable outcome. But identity can still influence the portion of the situation that is yours to influence. That's worth examining. There are a few phrases more revealing than, "That's just who I am." Sometimes that sentence represents healthy self-acceptance. Maybe someone is naturally quiet and genuinely enjoys a quieter life. There's no obligation to transform every personality trait, but sometimes "That's just who I am" means I've stopped investigating whether this can change. I've always been bad with money. That's just who I am. I never finish things. That's just who I am. I have a temper. That's just who I am. I can't speak in front of people. That's just who I am. Maybe. But ask, is this identity or is this practiced pattern? Because those aren't always the same thing. Consider the sentence, "I'm not disciplined." What does that actually mean? Does it mean you possess zero discipline in every domain? Probably not. Maybe you consistently arrive at work. Maybe you care for someone. Maybe you pay certain bills. Maybe you train regularly but struggle with studying. Maybe you can work intensely when somebody else sets the deadline, but struggle when you're responsible for creating the structure. Now the story, "I'm not disciplined," becomes more specific. I struggle to maintain routines when there isn't external accountability. That's a very different statement. The first sounds like identity. The second describes a pattern, and patterns can be investigated. What triggers it? Where does it happen? Where doesn't it happen? What environment changes it? What skills are missing? What system would make the desired behavior easier? Specificity gives you somewhere to work. Identity statements often end investigation. Negative identity stories aren't the only ones worth examining. Positive identities can trap us too. Imagine, "I'm the strong one." Sounds good, until strength means never asking for help. Now, "I'm the smart one." Sounds good, until being wrong becomes unbearable. Now, "I'm the successful one." Sounds good, until slowing down feels like you're losing yourself. Now, "I'm the person everybody can rely on." Sounds good, until you can't say no. "I'm independent." Sounds good, until receiving support feels like weakness. Even flattering stories can create prisons, because once identity becomes something you must constantly defend, new behavior can feel threatening. If your identity is, "I'm always right," learning becomes dangerous. If your identity is, "I never quit," walking away from a bad decision becomes psychologically difficult. Sometimes growth requires not merely abandoning negative stories, but loosening positive ones that have become too rigid. There's another layer. Identity isn't created entirely alone. Different people know different versions of you. Your parents may know one version, your closest friend, another, your coworkers, another, a partner, another. People who knew you 10 years ago may still interact with an outdated version, and you probably behave somewhat differently across environments. Does that mean one version is fake? Not necessarily. Human identity is partially relational. Certain qualities become more visible in certain contexts. You may be confident at work and uncertain in romance, quiet around strangers and ridiculous around friends, patient with children and impatient in traffic, analytical professionally and impulsive personally. So when you say, "This is who I am," which version are you talking about? Maybe identity is less like one photograph and more like an album. Our stories also depend heavily on memory, but memory isn't simply a perfect video archive that we can replay exactly. We remember selectively. Details can fade. Interpretations can change. Later experiences can affect how earlier events are understood. Think about a relationship that ended while you were in it. Certain memories may have meant one thing. 5 years later, you might interpret those same events differently or consider a difficult period in your life at the time. Everything is falling apart. Years later, that period forced me to change direction. The event didn't change. The meaning did. This tells us something important. Your relationship with your past can change, even when the past itself cannot. That doesn't mean rewriting facts. It means recognizing that meaning is not always frozen at the moment an event occurs. This is where the idea of rewriting your story can become dangerous if misunderstood. Suppose someone made serious mistakes. Rewriting the story does not mean those mistakes never happened. Suppose someone was genuinely harmed. Rewriting does not mean it wasn't bad. Suppose you fail. Rewriting does not mean, actually, I secretly succeeded. That's just denial. A more honest rewrite might sound like, I made a decision that caused real consequences. Understand more now than I did then. And I'm responsible for what I do next. Or, something painful happened to me. It affected me deeply. But I do not want the event to become the only explanation for who I am allowed to become. Or, I failed at this. That failure is a part of my history. It is not sufficient evidence that failure is my permanent identity. You don't rewrite the event. You reconsider the conclusion you've attached to the event. There's another danger here. If identity is a story, someone could misuse that idea to avoid responsibility. They could say, that's not who I am, after repeatedly behaving in a harmful way. But your preferred self-description doesn't erase your behavior. If someone repeatedly lies, but says, I'm an honest person, the story doesn't override the pattern. This is why identity must remain connected to evidence. Ask yourself, what do I repeatedly do? What do I practice? What do people consistently experience from me? What happens when my identity claim conflicts with my behavior? Sometimes the story needs to change because it's unnecessarily limiting. Other times, the story needs to change because it's protecting us from the uncomfortable truth. Both forms of examination matter. Let's make this practical. Write down 5 sentences beginning with, I am. For example, I am ambitious. I am awkward. I am dependable. I am bad with money. I am creative. Now take each sentence and ask, number 1, what evidence supports this? Not feelings, evidence. Number 2, what evidence contradicts it? Force yourself to look. Number 3, when did I start describing myself this way? Was there an event, a person, a repeated experience? Number 4, is this always true or contextually true? Maybe you're confident in one environment and hesitate in another. Number 5, does this identity help me understand myself or prevent me from changing? That last question matters because an identity can begin as an explanation and eventually become permission to stop growing. Suppose you want to change. Many people begin with an enormous declaration. I'm going to become a completely different person. That can feel inspiring for about 3 days. Instead, consider something smaller. Don't begin with claiming, "I'm disciplined now." Ask yourself, what would a disciplined action look like today? Don't say, "I'm confident." Ask, what would one confident action look like in this situation? Don't say, "I'm a reader." Read 10 pages. Don't say, "I'm financially responsible," and make one financially responsible decision. Don't say, "I'm someone who keeps promises to myself," and only keep one. Identity doesn't only create behavior. Behavior can also provide evidence for identity, which means the loop can run in the opposite direction. Action, evidence, story, expectation, and more action. One action doesn't prove a permanent identity, but repeated actions create stronger evidence. And that leads directly towards where we're going in episode 5. Here's something people rarely mention. When you begin behaving differently, your old identity may feel strangely comfortable, even if you dislike it. Suppose you've spent years saying, "I'm not athletic." Then you begin exercising constantly. At first, saying, "I'm someone who trains," may feel ridiculous. Why? Because the evidence is still new. Your old story has years of repetition behind it. The new story has only 3 Tuesdays. Give it some time. You don't need to manufacture certainty. You can use language that reflects reality. I'm becoming more consistent with exercise. I'm learning to handle money differently. I'm practicing speaking more directly. I'm becoming someone who finishes what I start. Notice the word, becoming. It respects both history and possibility. Here's a more uncomfortable question. Sometimes, when you change, other people may prefer the previous version. Maybe you were always available. Then you create boundaries. Someone might say, "You've changed." Maybe you were always quiet. Then you become more assertive. You've changed. Maybe you used to participate in certain habits. Then you stopped. You've changed. That statement isn't automatically criticism. Sometimes you've changed for the worse. That's possible. But sometimes you've changed simply means you are no longer behaving according to the version of you that was familiar and convenient to me. Growth can create social friction because identity is partly maintained by other people's expectations. That's another reason change can feel difficult. You're not only revising your own story, sometimes you're disrupting someone else's story about you. Personal growth is often described like warfare. Kill the old you. Destroy your former self. Become unrecognizable. But maybe that's unnecessarily hostile. Your past self made decisions with whatever knowledge, fear, ability, environment, maturity, and resources that were available at the time. Some decisions were good, some weren't. You can take responsibility without turning your entire history into an enemy. The goal isn't erase who I was. The goal is understand who I was well enough to choose what I can carry forward. Some traits deserve preservation. Some stories deserve gratitude. Some deserve revision. Some deserve retirement. And some deserve to remain unresolved while you gather better evidence. Here's the final twist. You don't only tell stories about your past. We tell stories about the future. Someday I'll be. I'll never be. People like me don't. I'm going to become. Future identity influences present choices. Imagine two versions of tomorrow. In one, you repeatedly tell yourself, I'm someone who can never understand this. In another, I don't understand this yet, but I can investigate whether I can learn it. Neither guarantees an outcome, but only one leaves the question open, and that's important. A useful identity doesn't have to promise success. Sometimes it simply refuses to declare the future closed before the evidence arrives. Here's your exercise for episode 4. Take out one piece of paper. At the top, write this: the story I tell about me. Then complete these sentences. I am. I am not. I always. I never. People like me. Someone like me can't. I've always been. My problem is. Don't censor your responses. Then choose one statement, not your entire identity, just one statement, and ask, where did this story come from? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? Is it a fact, a pattern, an interpretation, or a prediction? What does believing this story cause me to do? What does it prevent me from attempting? Then ask the most important question. What is a more precise version of this story? Not a more positive version, a more precise one. Instead of, I'm lazy, maybe say, I avoid tasks when they're vague and have no deadline. Instead of, I'm bad with money, maybe say, I haven't built a consistent system for managing money. Instead of, I'm awkward, maybe say, I become quiet when I'm around unfamiliar people. Instead of, I'm a failure, maybe say, several things I attempted didn't work, and I'm still deciding what those failures should teach me. Precision creates room, and room creates options. Think of one sentence you've been saying about yourself for years. Now imagine you weren't allowed to use it anymore. You couldn't say, that's just who I am. You had to describe the actual behavior instead. What would you say? And then ask, if I stopped defending this identity, what new behavior would become possible? Don't immediately reinvent yourself. Just notice where the story ends and where the evidence begins. So, let's close the file. Your identity matters. It gives continuity to your life. It connects your history, helps you understand your values, relationships, choices, and direction. But identity can become rigid when interpretations are mistaken for permanent facts. An experience becomes a conclusion becomes a pattern becomes a story becomes, that's just who I am. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's who you've been. Sometimes it's how you've behaved. Sometimes it's what someone called you. Sometimes it's how you've interpreted what happened. Sometimes it's a role that once helped you. Sometimes it's a story that once made sense but hasn't been examined in years. You don't need to erase your history. You don't need to invent a fantasy. You don't need to pretend every limitation is imaginary. You simply need enough distance to ask, is this identity still supported by the evidence? And if it isn't, maybe you don't need a completely new personality. Maybe you need a more accurate sentence. The takeaway from episode 4 is, your past provides evidence about who you've been. It does not automatically dictate every person you're capable of becoming. So, to recap, Episode 1 asked, who are you? Episode 2 asked, are you examining how you live? Episode 3 asked, are your thoughts actually fact? Episode 4 asked, what story have those thoughts created about you? But now, we've reached the practical problem, because you can rewrite your story all day. You can say, I'm disciplined, I'm courageous, I'm dependable, I'm becoming better. But eventually, the words have to meet behavior, because character isn't built from the identity you announce. It's built from what you repeatedly practice. And that's the next file. Episode 5. Character is what you practice. If identity is the story you tell about yourself, character is the evidence you create through repetition. That's where we're going next.